Today's big question: why is Africa curved? In 1885, European powers met up in Berlin to carve Africa up amongst themselves. They drew borders, created colonies, and generally decided the fate of millions without really considering what would happen next or how their decisions would affect people living there. It was a treaty between 14 European countries and the United States, all of them colonial powers with interests in Africa. But after the act, they agreed to a set of rules that would govern their behavior in the region. By the turn of the century, only Liberia and Ethiopia remained independent. And by 1914, the entire continent was under the control of European powers. One of the most important provisions of the treaty was the requirement that European powers notify each other of their plans to colonize any part of Africa. This was intended to prevent a colonial race and to ensure that all European powers had a chance to participate in the scramble for Africa. This meant that black people in the Congo could not escape to the coast to trade with European ships. The Belgians also drew borders that cut off access to the sea for many African groups, such as the Herero and the Namakwa in Namibia. The main purpose of the treaty was to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa. They set up systems of racial segregation and discrimination that made it difficult for black Africans to move freely within their own continent. For example, in South Africa, the British created a pass system that required black Africans to carry a document that allowed them to be outside their designated areas. But it also included provisions for the exploration and exploitation of the continent's resources. But it was not until the late 1970s and early 1980s that African countries began to win their independence. Many African countries are still poor and dependent on Europe, and the borders that were drawn in Berlin in 1884 remain largely unchanged. Before we get into why Africa's curved, we should probably explain what the Berlin Act of 1885 actually was. Before the Berlin Act, European powers had been competing for control of Africa for decades. But despite these provisions, the Berlin Act did not prevent the rapid colonization of Africa. For centuries, black Africans had been resisting European colonialism. In the 19th century, there were many successful slave rebellions in the Americas. In Africa itself, there were many groups that resisted European colonization. So why is Africa curved? The answer's simple. It's because the Europeans who colonized Africa were racist, and they drew borders to keep black people from escaping their clutches. The Europeans realized that if they didn't do something to stop the spread of black liberation ideas, then the entire continent could potentially rise up and overthrow European colonialism. For example, in the Congo, the Belgians drew a border that separated the Congo River from the Atlantic Ocean. In addition to these physical barriers, the Europeans also created artificial ones. Despite these efforts, black resistance to European colonialism continued throughout the 20th century. Today, Africa is still dealing with the legacy of European colonialism. If you want to learn more about the Berlin Act of 1885, I've included some resources in the description below. Thanks for watching.